A dusty army truck rattled down a dirt road in Kansas, its cargo 12 captured Wehrmacht engineers who had once designed tanks, bridges, and engines for a dying empire. They were told they would spend the next months helping American farmers with harvest work. The men laughed bitterly, assuming they would be pulling plows behind mules, another humiliation to add to defeat. When the truck stopped and the tailgate dropped, what they saw froze every grin. Across the horizon, a formation of yellow Caterpillar tractors moved in perfect rhythm, like armored beasts on a silent parade ground. Their blades cut through the soil with effortless precision, each machine guided not by soldiers or officers, but by farm boys barely out of school. One of the German engineers whispered, "They don't raise soldiers, they raise giants." That sentence hung in the air like an omen. The Americans they met that morning did not gloat, did not shout, did not even wear uniforms. The farmer who greeted them, a man named Thomas Henderson, simply handed out work gloves and a loaf of still warm bread. "We start early, we finish honest," he said. The engineers exchanged glances, unsure if it was an order or a philosophy. What stunned them more than the scale of machinery was the absence of hierarchy. The boy driving the tractor joked with his father as an equal, and the local mechanic adjusted the gears without waiting for permission. For men raised to salute every command, the rhythm of this place felt like another planet. As the day unfolded, the engineers noticed a pattern. Every task was shared, every meal eaten together, and every machine maintained with a quiet devotion that bordered on reverence. There was no fear here, only motion, efficiency, and something they couldn't yet name. The sky stretched endlessly, wheat fields breathing in waves of gold. For the first time since their capture, none of them thought about the Reich. They were staring at something larger than ideology, a living system that worked because people trusted each other. By sunset, the convoy of tractors parked in a neat line beside the barn. The farmer's wife rang a bell for supper. The prisoners sat on wooden benches and were served stew, cornbread, and coffee stronger than any ration back home. One engineer looked at his calloused hands and muttered, half to himself, "In Germany, we built machines to destroy. Here, they build them to feed." He didn't know anyone had heard him. But Thomas, passing by with another loaf of bread, paused just long enough to nod. The camera would linger on that scene. Volksmeiset. The twilight, the smell of warm bread, the silent realization spreading through 12 men who had spent their lives mastering destruction. What they saw on this Kansas farm was not weakness. It was the kind of strength that didn't need to march. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it where you are? The next morning, before dawn, the engineers heard a sound that shook their sleep. Not artillery, but a low, rolling thunder from the granary. As they stepped outside, the early light revealed a scene they could hardly process. The barn doors slid open, and a torrent of wheat cascaded down a wooden chute into a truck bed, roaring like an avalanche. The air filled with golden dust, the scent of grain, and the hum of work that never seemed to end. It was the sound of abundance, the silence of fear being drowned by plenty. One of the prisoners, Lieutenant Klaus Bender, once a bridge designer from Dresden, stood motionless. He had calculated loads, capacities, and tolerances all his life, but he had never seen this, a single farm storing more food than an entire German town. The ground shook beneath his boots. "If we had this much grain," he murmured to another engineer, "we'd never have followed anyone to war." The sentence, spoken without anger or irony, carried a weight that stunned even himself. Around them, American workers moved in steady rhythm, women driving trucks, elderly men operating winches, and boys measuring sacks with precision. There was no shouting, no inspection, no fear of mistakes. Each person seemed to know instinctively what to do, as if the harvest were a shared heartbeat. The prisoners found themselves caught between awe and confusion. How could a nation so informal, so unmilitarized, command such order? At noon, when the work paused, Thomas Henderson showed them the storage records. The figures made the Germans exchange nervous smiles. 40,000 bushels in one silo, 15,000 in another, a yield that could feed 10,000 men for a year. Across Kansas alone, over 100 million bushels were harvested that season. To the prisoners, these numbers felt like artillery statistics, but aimed at hunger, not people. The hum of the grain trucks replaced the rhythm of gunfire they had known. In that hum, there was no glory, no medal, just the relentless sound of life being sustained. One of them, Corporal Weber, wrote in his small notebook that night, "Today, I saw wheat fall like bombs, but no one died. Perhaps this is how peace sounds." Evenings came gently in Kansas. The prisoners sat outside their barracks, the horizon burning orange. They could hear the granary still echoing faintly across the fields. Each rumble carried something unfamiliar, safety. And in that safety, the realization that America's power did not come from fear or conquest, but from the refusal to let anyone starve. As they prepared for sleep, a few of them whispered to each other in German, trying to explain the feeling that had begun to creep in. Envy without hatred. They didn't know that the U.S. Army had chosen Kansas farms specifically to show them what free production looked like. It was not propaganda. It was proof. If you were there, standing in that dust with a handful of wheat, what would you have thought? Pride or shame? By the third week, the engineers had stopped counting days. Work no longer felt like punishment. Each morning, they woke before sunrise to the rhythm of diesel engines. Not tanks or trucks, but tractors. When the first machine roared to life, it sent a vibration through the air that settled deep in their chests. They began to recognize the sound patterns, the idle rumble, the gear shift, the steady growl that never missed a beat. It was not the sound of war. It was the heartbeat of a country that never panicked. Klaus Bender began taking notes again. He measured the 6-cylinder engines, noted fuel efficiency, torque ratios, even maintenance intervals. But his entries grew strange, less technical, more reflective. "These engines breathe evenly," he wrote, "because their owners are not afraid. In Germany, every machine breathes for the Führer. Here, they breathe for the land." His companions read the line and said nothing. At midday, they gathered near a John Deere tractor parked under the sun. Thomas Henderson, with a grin, invited one of them to climb up and drive. Weber hesitated, looking at the farmer's daughter standing nearby with folded arms. "Go ahead," she said. "It's just a clutch and courage." The tractor jolted forward, then steadied, slicing the soil open like silk. For the first time, Weber felt the thrill of control without command. No one shouted at him. No one kept time. The rhythm was his own. In the afternoon heat, sweat mixed with the scent of oil and wheat. The machines kept running, their pistons moving like lungs. The Americans seemed to treat every piece of equipment as an extension of themselves. There was no distinction between farmer and mechanic, between engineer and laborer. To men raised in a system obsessed with ranks, this equality was unsettling. When the sun dropped, the engineers sat together by the barn and listened. In the distance, dozens of tractors still worked under floodlights, dotting the plains like slow-moving stars. The combined roar and hum merged into a single tone, low and endless. Weber turned to Bender and whispered, "It's the sound of a country breathing steadily, not marching." That night, the camp was quiet. A guard reading a newspaper by lantern light mentioned casually that America had built 24,000 Sherman tanks that year, more than Germany had in the entire war. Yet the real shock for the engineers wasn't the number. It was how the same factories that built tanks could, in peacetime, switch back to building tractors in a matter of weeks. Abundance and adaptability. Two words they had never put together. As darkness thickened, Bender sat by the window of the barracks and drew a simple sketch in his notebook. A tractor wheel turning beside a heartbeat line. Below it, he wrote, "Machines that live for life, not for death." The ink bled slightly, but the meaning stayed clear. Somewhere beyond the fields, the sound of an engine started again, and he realized it wasn't noise. It was America dreaming aloud. By midsummer, the Kansas fields shimmered with light, and the war felt like a rumor from another planet. The engineers had grown tanned, lean, and oddly content. One afternoon, while checking irrigation pumps, they found themselves standing beside Thomas Henderson again, who was bent over a fuel gauge with a wrench in one hand and a notebook in the other. He spoke numbers fluently, gallons per acre, yield ratios, engine hours per harvest. Klaus, unable to resist, asked through his accent, "You study mechanics?" Thomas looked up, smiling under his hat. "No, I just fix what I use." The exchange hit the Germans harder than any lecture. In their world, engineers belonged to universities and ministries, far from the mud. Here, every farmer was an engineer by instinct. Knowledge was not stored in offices, it lived in calloused hands. They realized that American strength came not from centralized command, but from distributed competence. Millions of citizens who understood both the why and the how of what they touched. As the day went on, they joined the Hendersons in repairing a broken threshing machine. Each person worked on a part. Thomas on the chain belt, his wife on the sieve, the prisoners cleaning the filters. It was unspoken cooperation, effortless and wordless. When the engine coughed back to life, everyone cheered, even the guards. For the Germans, this moment of shared triumph carried a quiet humiliation, the kind that heals instead of wounds. That evening, Thomas invited them to the porch for lemonade. He pointed to the horizon, where windmills turned slowly under the orange sky. "Each one keeps the wells alive," he said. "No orders, no officers, just motion and maintenance." Klaus nodded, thinking of the vast bureaucracy that had once run Germany's war machine. "We had engineers," he whispered, "but we never had this kind of intelligence." In his diary that night, he wrote, "Today I saw knowledge walking barefoot." His companion Weber added beneath it, "Freedom is knowing how things work, not waiting for someone to command them." Later, under the dim barracks light, a small argument broke out among the prisoners. Some insisted that this was all a show, propaganda designed to break their pride. But when the lights went out and the wind carried the sound of distant machines humming through the night, no one could fully believe that anymore. The truth was too practical, too tangible, too alive. Outside, the Hendersons' dog barked once, then settled. The horizon glowed faintly with the reflection of refinery flames, a reminder that even the farthest industry served the same rhythm, production without panic. America did not need to shout about its greatness. It simply ran the engines, balanced the books, and fixed what broke. The engineers, who once worshipped design as a religion, began to understand something sacred in simplicity. And in that understanding, the boundary between captor and captive quietly dissolved. One Sunday evening, the harvest paused. The prisoners were invited into the Henderson farmhouse for supper, an event so ordinary to the Americans that it felt ceremonial to the Germans. The dining table was long and made of pine, worn smooth by years of elbows and laughter. A pot of stew steamed in the center, flanked by bowls of corn, butter, and biscuits. Before anyone ate, Thomas bowed his head and said, "Lord, thank you for rain and hands that work." The words were simple, unpolished, but when the Germans raised their eyes, something had shifted. They had expected prayers for victory, not gratitude for rain. The room glowed with lantern light. Photographs of ancestors hung on the wall, not generals or politicians, but farmers, mothers, children. The engineers ate quietly at first, unsure how to respond to the easy warmth around them. Then, the farmer's daughter, Emily, slid a small bowl toward Klaus. "More potatoes," she said, smiling. It was such a natural gesture that Klaus nearly forgot he was a prisoner. He whispered thanks in English, clumsy but sincere. The silence that followed was the most human moment of his captivity. After dinner, conversation flowed freely. Thomas asked about bridges on the Rhine. His wife wanted to know how cold Germany truly was in winter. Weber, the mechanic, tried to explain the design of a Panzer transmission, and Thomas countered with the workings of a combine gearbox. The two men leaned over a napkin, sketching with a pencil, discovering a shared language of bolts and gears. When Thomas's wife laughed at their intensity, the room joined in, an entire enemy table dissolving into laughter over machinery. When they left the house, the Kansas night spread wide and silent. Fireflies drifted above the wheat, and the air smelled of oil and bread. Weber looked back through the window. The family was clearing the table, talking softly. "They don't eat to survive," he murmured. "They eat to stay together." The next morning, something had changed inside them. The engineers worked faster, not because of orders, but out of respect. They oiled the tools, aligned the belts, tuned the engines, as if the machines belonged to them. When Thomas thanked them, they replied not as soldiers, but as men. In his diary that night, Klaus wrote, "I came here to build machines. Instead, I am being rebuilt." He never learned that the army psychologist observing them from a distance wrote in his report, "Cultural immersion is producing self-critique faster than interrogation ever could." For the first time since their capture, they were not thinking about returning home. They were thinking about what home meant. If you sat at that table surrounded by people once called your enemies, what would you feel? Would pride survive a kindness like that? Or would it finally surrender? Autumn crept across Kansas, turning the wheat stubble pale and the skies silver. The harvest was finished, the silos full, and the sense of movement slowed into reflection. The engineers were changed men, though not all of them accepted it easily. Inside the barracks, after lights out, whispers grew into arguments. Klaus, who now fixed engines without being told, believed they had glimpsed something greater than victory, a civilization built on trust. Weber agreed, calling it strength without shouting. But another, Sergeant Vogel, slammed his fist on the table. "You think these smiles aren't weapons? They want to make us forget who we are." His words split the group in half. Some nodded, uneasy, others shook their heads. The argument stretched into the night. Weber stood and faced Vogel. "Back home, we worked in silence while bombs fell on our families. Here, they sing while they work. Which silence would you rather live with?" The room froze. A guard nearby didn't interrupt. He had heard this debate before, not in English or German, but in the universal language of men deciding what kind of world they wanted after war. A week later, Vogel was caught tearing down a hand-painted sign the Americans had placed in the mess hall: "Work freely, eat fairly." When the camp commander asked why, Vogel said, "It's propaganda." The commander, a quiet major from Ohio, replied, "Then explain why you tore it down instead of ignoring it." Vogel had no answer. He was not punished, only told to repaint the sign himself. He did, slowly, in silence. Outside the wire, the world was shifting. American factories were already scaling down war production, converting back to peacetime goods, tractors, refrigerators, tools. The numbers were staggering. In 1945 alone, the United States built over 100,000 civilian vehicles while still fighting on two fronts. For the engineers, this was proof that power here never depended on war. It simply changed direction. That realization cut deep. Klaus wrote, "We built an empire on fear of scarcity. They built a nation on faith in surplus." Weber added, "We feared running out of iron. They feared running out of bread." One evening, during roll call, Thomas Henderson arrived at the gate with a crate of apples. "For your trip back soon," he said. The men accepted them, awkwardly. Vogel held one in his hand, turning it over like a grenade that refused to explode. He finally took a bite and said quietly, "Sweet, too sweet." That night, Klaus looked around the dim barracks, where men once proud of precision now spoke softly of planting, building, repairing. He realized the war had not ended with surrender. It was ending here, in the slow dismantling of fear. If you had stood among them, hearing one man argue for pride and another for peace, which side would you have taken? And would your answer still be the same today? April 1945. The war was collapsing in Europe, but in the Kansas plains, the wind still smelled of wheat and oil. The Wehrmacht engineers were told they would soon be repatriated. The news stirred a strange silence among them. Not joy, not sorrow, something in between. They had come as prisoners, but they were leaving as witnesses. That morning, Thomas Henderson asked if they would like to walk one last time through the fields. They followed him out, beyond the barns, boots sinking softly into the soil they had learned to respect. The sky stretched endlessly, pale and cloudless, the kind of horizon no wall could divide. Thomas stopped beside the wheat shoots just beginning to rise. "We plant now for what we'll never eat," he said. "That's the deal we make with tomorrow." The men didn't reply. They didn't need to. Klaus crouched and ran his fingers through the young wheat. "It's soft," he murmured. "Ours at home is coarser." Thomas smiled. "Give it rain and it'll toughen." It sounded like advice for more than crops. Weber took a photograph from his pocket. One of the supper table, the Hendersons smiling beside their guests. The back bore a sentence written in pencil: "We eat together. That's why we never fear hunger or war." He stared at it for a long time before sliding it into his coat. Years later, that same photograph would be found among his belongings in Munich. Edges worn, handwriting faded, the plate on the table barely visible, but the faces unmistakably at peace. Before boarding the truck that would take them to the railway, the prisoners lined up by the fence. The Hendersons came to shake their hands. No guards shouted. No guns were raised. A few Americans waved their hats, and one little girl, Emily, pressed a small envelope into Klaus's hand. Inside was a single wheat seed taped to a card. Beneath it, written in neat child's handwriting, "For planting, not for keeping." As the truck rolled away, dust rose behind them. None of the Germans spoke for miles. Only the rumble of the engine and the distant hum of tractors filled the air. In that sound, they heard everything they had learned, a heartbeat, steady enough to survive any war. When they reached the camp for departure processing, an American officer asked each man a routine question. Occupation before capture? When Klaus's turn came, he hesitated, then answered quietly, "Engineer." The officer nodded and stamped the form. But in his heart, Klaus knew the truth had changed. He was no longer an engineer of destruction. He had become a builder of understanding. The next morning, he wrote his final entry. America never feared the war because it never stopped sowing. While we built walls of steel, they built fields of trust. I hope to do the same when I return. Somewhere behind him, the wheat fields of Kansas shimmered, endless and indifferent, whispering the one lesson that outlives every victory. Life continues when men learn to share it. Years later, when the world had rebuilt itself and new borders replaced old ones, the former Wehrmacht engineers rarely spoke about their months in Kansas. Yet every one of them carried something invisible home. A seed, a memory, a sound. The sound was not of gunfire or engines of war, but of tractors turning under the wide sky, the pulse of a nation that worked in rhythm rather than command. Those who survived long enough to see the post-war miracle in Europe often said quietly that the blueprint for peace was not drawn in conferences or treaties. It was found in the hum of those farms, in the way a farmer trusted his neighbor more than his government, and in how a meal could dismantle more hate than 1,000 speeches. Klaus kept Emily's wheat seed in a glass jar on his shelf. He never planted it, yet every spring he took it out, held it to the light, and whispered, "Still breathing." Weber, who later helped rebuild bridges across the Rhine, insisted on naming one of them the Concordia crossing after the camp. His reason was simple, because it was there that enemies learned to speak without words. In their old age, the men gathered sometimes in cafes, talking about fuel ratios, irrigation systems, and the strange grace of the American plains. They did not glorify their past. They measured it against the quiet dignity they had witnessed. When asked what truly defeated them, Klaus answered, abundance. Not as an accusation, but as revelation, that a country which could feed the world had no reason to fear it. And so history's lesson softened into something deeply human. Power without compassion is brittle, but labor shared freely becomes the architecture of peace. Somewhere tonight, a tractor hums under a wide sky, steady and unafraid. The same sound that once echoed across Kansas still carries a message through time. That strength is not how loud a nation roars, but how calmly it continues to build after the guns have gone silent.